As we're going through the different sections of the book of Revelation, what we're seeing is that the book of Revelation consists of a number of parallel sections. Each of these sections, using different imagery, basically talks about the history of the church from the first century up until the time of the second coming of Christ. And these sections end with a symbolic depiction of the second coming of Christ, the judgment on unbelievers, and the vindication of believers. So, for example, the last section that we talked about was Revelation chapters 12 through chapter 15, verse 4, which recounted the history of the church. In chapter 12, talked a lot about the beasts in chapter 13, and then had another vision of the church, the 144,000 and the great multitude in chapter 14. But chapter 14 ended with a vision of the reapers reaping both the redeemed and the non-redeemed at the end of chapter 14, and then a picture of the church in triumph in the first four verses of chapter 15. This next section is chapter 15, verse 5, through the end of chapter 16. And this section basically recounts the seven bowl judgments. You'll recall that in chapter 6 we had the seal judgments. Then in chapters 8 and 9 we had the seven trumpet judgments. And now we have the bowl judgments. But there's a couple of interesting things we need to note about this. With the trumpets, the bowls the bowl judgments occur in the same order and deal with the same issues as the trumpet judgments. For example, the trumpet judgments in chapters 8 and 9, the first one dealt with the earth and water, or dealt with the earth, and then the same with the bowls in chapter 16, verse 2. Then the second trumpet judgment dealt with the sea, and water was turned to blood. The same thing occurs with the second bowl in Revelation 16, verse 3. The sea is turned into blood. The next trumpet, the third trumpet, was poured out on the rivers and the springs. The same is true in chapter 16, verse 4. The third angel pours his bowl into the rivers and springs of water, and they become like blood. The fourth trumpet was on the river Euphrates. And, I apologize. The fourth was on the sun. And the same is true here with the bowl judgments. In Revelation 16, verse 8, the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was given to scorch men with fire, and they blasphemed God. Then the fifth bowl, or rather the fifth trumpet and the fifth bowl judgment are on the realm of evil. The fifth trumpet, you may recall, was at the beginning of chapter 9, and there we saw the angel fall from heaven, and it talks about the abyss, or the bottomless pit, and the demon locusts were released from the earth. Well, likewise here, in chapter 16, verse 10, the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was darkened, and they gnawed their tongues because of pain, and they blasphemed the God of heaven because of the pains and their sores, and they did not repent of their deeds. So remember, the beast had been talked about in chapter 13, and so now that is being judged. Then the sixth, both trumpet and bowl were on the river Euphrates. And so in chapter 16, verse 12, the sixth angel pours out his bowl on the Euphrates. Its water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And then the seventh trumpet and the seventh bowl, and the seventh bowl begins in verse 17. The angel poured out his bowl on the air, and a loud voice came from the temple of the throne saying, "It is done." And there were flashes of lightning, sounds, thunders, and an earthquake, and great hail. Now, we need to recall, so there's parallelism between the trumpets and the bowls, but we've said that the book is what's known as progressively parallel because there's additional information added, and in the Bible it talks about that the bowls are sort of the final wrath of God. But we need to remember that we may think because the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are numbered that they follow sequentially. In fact, however, Revelation is not a chronological narrative from beginning to end. And I think that the seals, trumpets, and bowls are not necessarily following in order or sequential, but maybe simultaneous. And that is indicated in the sixth bowl, which talks about the fifth bowl was poured out on the throne of the beast, and the kingdom was darkened, and they gnawed their tongues because of pain, and they blasphemed God because of their pains and their sores. Well, pains and sores do not result from darkness, but so the pains and sores actually goes back to the first bowl, which is poured out on the earth, and it says that it became loathsome and malignant sores on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. So again, there's different imagery here, but this may be, in fact, these bowls may, in fact, be largely simultaneous and not sequential. Now, additionally, the bowls, as with the trumpets, they parallel the imagery of the plagues on Egypt during the time of the Exodus. So, for example, the first bowl in verse 2 of chapter 16 talks about sores. Well, that corresponds to the sixth Exodus plague. The second and third bowls talk about water being turned into blood. That corresponds with the first Exodus plague. The fifth bowl talks about darkness. That corresponds to the ninth Exodus plague. The sixth bowl, it talks about, in verse 13, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. Well, you may recall that the second Exodus plague was the plague of frogs. And the seventh bowl, in verses 17 through 21, talk about great hail, and that corresponds to the seventh Exodus plague. So again, as we've seen John doing again and again, using different imagery, but he's taking things that had a basis in history, applied to ancient Israel in the Exodus, but now he's universalizing them as applying to the entire world. And so, again, the first bowl is poured out on the entire earth. Now, the sixth and seventh bowls are connected. The sixth bowl prepares the way for the final war against God, and it results in the seventh bowl, which is, again, a symbolic depiction of the second coming of Christ and all that that entails. Now, in the, well, let me first talk about the sixth bowl, because that is talking about being poured out on the great river Euphrates to prepare the way for the kings of the east. And as we mentioned this in connection with the the sixth trumpet being poured out on the Euphrates, don't think of the literal river Euphrates. Now, again, it talks about in chapter 16, verse 12, the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. Now, that again is drawing on history, because when King Cyrus was attacking Babylon, he did in fact divert and dry up the Euphrates so that his army could enter into ancient Babylon. And so now this is being universalized, because it's talking about this is preparing the way for the final judgment. And the final judgment of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, is talked about in chapters 17 through the beginning of chapter 19, but it's also mentioned here in chapter 16 in connection with the seventh bowl. In chapter 16, verse 19, it says, "The great city was split into three parts, and the cities and nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found." So, Babylon the Great, again, don't think of it as just an individual city. We know that because in chapter 17, verse 1, and chapter 17 and 18 focus on Mystery Babylon. It describes Babylon, it says, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." And so the harlot is elsewhere described, and then on her forehead, chapter 17, verse 5, on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So it's talking about this harlot, also called Mystery Babylon. She sits on many waters, and it is a mystery. She has the abominations of the earth. So Babylon the Great, again, is a symbol. The harlot is a symbol, not for an individual woman, not for an individual city, but a worldwide anti-Christian culture, government, society, and religion. And so when it talks about in chapter 16, verse 12, the angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up. The river and the water corresponds to Babylon, or the harlot, sitting on many waters. So, again, the Euphrates is being universalized here to talk about judgment, because just as the Euphrates was literally dried up to when Cyrus dealt and invaded and took over literal city of Babylon, now these same symbols are being used, but being universalized to talk about judgment on the whole unbelieving earth. And I should just point out, there is some dispute among scholars who are the kings of the earth. Some view them as basically pagan hordes who join forces with the kings of the whole world to do battle against the Messiah. And it says that we talked about immediately after, in verse 12, it talks about drying up the Euphrates and its water to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then we talked about, it says in verse 13, "I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the beast, and the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are the spirits of demons performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world, to gather them together for the war of the great God, the Almighty." So one view has the kings of the east being equated with the kings of the whole world. There's another view that looks at the kings of the east as unbelievers, because the word for east also means rising or the position of the rising sun, and that was a familiar symbol for Messiah in New Testament times. And so it's pointing to something or someone of heavenly origin. And in chapter 7, verse 2, for example, it talked about, I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God. And he cried out with a loud voice to the four angels whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea. So there, an angel is coming with the seal from God, and so it may well be that the same kind of, from the rising sun, in other words, from the east. So it's a little unclear as to who exactly the kings of the east are. It may be that they are to be set in opposition. If they are positive, if they are the forces of the gospel, then the kings of the east are set in opposition to the kings of the world who are mentioned in verse 14, in contrast. And so in that case, the kings of the east may be the equivalent of the heavenly armies that accompany Christ when he comes back to the earth. Those heavenly armies will be mentioned in chapter 19. But so what we see here is the bowls correspond and parallel the trumpets in their order and on whom and on what they were poured. The sixth bowl is preparing the way for the second coming of Christ and the great war that is going to be waged between the non-believers against Christ. And now we know that the church is present at this time. You know, again, some people think that the church is removed from the earth. That cannot possibly be true, because in verse 14 of chapter 16, it talks about the spirits performing signs. They go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Now, verse 15 says, Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So, Jesus is saying, I am coming like a thief. Exactly what he has said elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 24, verse 43, and in Revelation 3, verse 3. Christ is repeating, those are warnings to the church. So the church has to be present at this time, just before the end. And also, when it says, Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, blessed is the one who stays awake, also repeats exhortations that Jesus made to the church in Matthew 24 and in Matthew 25. And the reference to the clothes is, again, a warning that Jesus has given us. Remember, we've talked about the fact that the clothing, the fine linen, are the righteous acts of the saints. And in the 7 letters to the 7 churches, in Revelation 2 and 3, remember he told Laodicea in chapter 3, verse 18, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may become rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself, and that the shame of your nakedness will not be revealed. And so he's basically telling the church in Laodicea, and he's repeating the same thing here in chapter 16, verse 15, stay faithful. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked and people will not see his shame. He's telling the church, you are going to go through hard times before I come again, but remain faithful to me. Stay awake, know what's going on, and keep your clothes on, because all of this is part of God's plan. Then it talks about, in verse 16, how They gathered them together uh, for this final battle against God in a place called Harmageddon. And we talked about that symbolism, I think, in one of the very first lectures. Then the seventh bowl is poured out in chapter 16, verses 17 through 21. The seventh angel poured out his bowl on the air. And remember, why the air? Because Satan is called the prince of the power of the air. And so, the second coming, the first bowl was poured out on the earth. The last bowl is poured out on the air. And in other words, what he is doing is symbolizing the fact that when Christ comes again, it will affect everything and will go to the root of the matter. Because remember, it talks about the bowl, the fifth angel being poured out on the throne of the beast. Well, when we talked about that, remember we saw that the power behind the throne of the beast is actually Satan himself. He holds all the power. The diadems were on the dragon's head, and the diadems were on the horns of the beast. Well, so now the seventh angel is pouring out the seventh bowl on the air, the prince of the power of the air. A loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." So again, it's this language. It is finished. This is the end. So just as in the end of Revelation 14, just as at the end of Revelation chapter 6, and at the end of chapter 11, we are seeing a picture of the final act of history at the second coming. And then there are flashes of lightning, sounds and peals of thunder. Verse 18, there's a great earthquake, such as there has not been since man came to be upon the earth, so that an earthquake, so great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into three parts. The cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. So, verse 19 is talking about the wrath of the wine of God, or the wine of the wrath of God, repeating the language used at the end of chapter 14, where it talks about the harvest of the grapes. He threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress was trodden. Blood came out of them from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. And so, also in chapter 14, verse 10, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. So again, these are same images to keep telling us that these sections are parallel. They end with the second coming and the judgment on unbelievers. Now, verses 20 and 21. Every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague was exceedingly severe. Well, again, every island fled away, the mountains were not found. That is just repeating the same kind of language that had been found at the end of chapter 6, verse 14, where it says, the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And so those are events that can only happen once, okay? And so we're seeing this repetition, number one, to emphasize this. It's using different symbolism, but often repeating, as we've seen, the exact same language regarding the mountains and the islands flying away, moved out of their place, the winepress of the wrath of God, and so on and so forth, the lightning, the thunder, the earthquakes, and so on, all symbolic of God's coming to the earth in final judgment. And so what we have here, and we're going to see this again, by the way, in Revelation 19 and 20. When we, again, it will be talking about, in Revelation 19, Satan gathering the kings and the armies and the people for the war of the world against God. So this imagery is used, it will be repeated, and and to show us the climactic event of history. So we've seen now in these multiple sections, the end of chapter 6 ends with the second coming and judgment. Chapter 11, same thing, using very similar imagery. Chapter 14, same thing, again using very similar imagery. Now here at the end of chapter 16, it uses very similar imagery in talking about the second coming and what that will entail. These are things, I think, they're very strong images, but John is using them, number one, to comfort the church, to say, yes, the church may go through very hard times. The beast and Satan are both active, yet they are both doomed, and their doom is certain. And he repeats that to emphasize this, and therefore we can draw comfort to know, again, whatever happens on the earth ultimately stems from what happens in heaven. Because remember, it is the angels who have the bowls, who pour them out on the earth, and that causes all of these things to happen. Just like the angels sounded the trumpets in the same order and on the same places. And just as Christ broke the seals, what happens, what begins in heaven, then plays out on the earth. But ultimately, it is resulting in the second coming of Christ, the destruction of all of the forces of evil, and then the inauguration of the new heaven and the new earth, in which all evil, sin, and death will be eradicated forever. Now, the next section, chapter 17, 18, through the beginning of chapter 19, they're going to focus on Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, this worldwide entity. Babylon has been mentioned before, and its doom was mentioned in chapter 16, verse 19. But now the focus is going to be on Babylon, aspects of what this great anti-Christian world culture and empire are like. But at the end of this next section, again, we will see the destruction of Mystery Babylon and the avenging of the blood of the saints. And so, again, the next section is very similar to what has gone before. We've come to the end of time and the second coming at the end of chapter 16. Well, now we go back in time. We go through history of the church and its opponents, Mystery Babylon, through 17 and 18. But then we saw at the end of chapter 16, Mystery Babylon was given the cup of the wine of God's fierce wrath. At the time, every island fled away and the mountains were not found. That's the second coming. We're going to see at the end of chapter 18 and beginning of chapter 19, that same time period, namely the destruction of Mystery Babylon. So we'll deal with that in the next lecture.